So this is our last seminar of the term. So we have a round table with three, amazing presenters. I'm going to get to that soon. So I just want to say that the research seminar at IPP is happening every other Wednesday, although next term it may be on Tuesdays, but okay. So we're trying to discuss or trying to make that bridge between research and policy, and we are challenging or looking to the challenges we're facing right now, from like green transition, climate change, also the role of the state, obviously the issue of inflation, which has been a problem in the last, should I say, a year? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and the implications that has for the entire society, including, of course, the poorest households, which we're also going to unpack that a little bit. So yeah, so thank you very much for coming. So our first speaker would be Yeva Nersisyan. Thank you very much for being here, Yeva. Yeva is Associate Professor of Economics at Franklin and Marshall College and a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College. She has a PhD in Economics and Mathematics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Thank you. So she is a macroeconomist working in modern money theory, MMT, post-Keynesian and institutionalist traditions. Her research interests include banking and financial instability, fiscal and monetary theory and policy, and she has also published a number of papers on the topics of shadow banking, fiscal policy, government deficits, and debt, and the Green New Deal. Currently, Eva is co-editing the Elgar Companion of Modern Money Theory with Randall Ray. So we're very looking forward to this. So then we have Isabella Weber, our next speaker, who is a political economist working on China, global trade, and the history of economic thought. She's assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, I hate that word, Amherst, and the research leader for China at the Political Economy Research Institute. Isabella holds a PhD in economics from the New School and also from Cambridge, and she was a visiting researcher at Tsinghua University, China, I assume. So her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, The Market Reform Debates, the winner of the John Robinson Prize 2021, and also was awarded the best book of many 2021 lists around the globe. And more recently, Isabella has been involved with the public debate in inflation and advising the government, the German government, regarding the gas price break, which they're adopting recently. And finally, we have here with us Torsten Bell in person. So he's the only one who is real today. Who is
just less exotic. It's like less exciting, really.
And Torsten is the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, a think tank here in the UK that combines analytical rigor with policy prescription to improve the living standards of those in Britain on low to middle incomes. And it's a fantastic foundation. You should check it out, everything they do. He has a background in economic policy, and his research focuses on economic change, inequality, the labor market, tax and benefits, and wealth. Prior to leading the Resolution Foundation, Torsten was the director of policy for the Labour Party. I didn't know about that.
I've lost a lot of elections. Anyone wants advice? I've got it.
He also worked for the Treasury as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the financial crisis and as a civil servant. Fantastic.
You want to nationalise banks? Also done that.
Torsten is a trustee of the Child Poverty Action Group and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So I'm sorry for taking long to introduce them, but I think that I want to show how special that evening is and how we have probably here one of the best scholars and intellectuals to talk about inflation today. So yes, Yeva, I'm passing the floor to you. Thank you.
All right. So I want to talk about the current inflation that we are facing today, and my focus is largely on the United States, but I think what I say about the US applies to a lot of economists, especially developed economies, including that of the UK. What I want to look at is whether the current inflation we're seeing is a demand issue or a supply issue, and ultimately what are the kinds of solutions that we should be reaching for. And I'm going to go against the consensus, the mainstream consensus, and say that monetary policy is really not the right tool. So that's basically my conclusion. And I would say it's not just not the right tool for this current inflationary episode. In general, I'm going to argue that monetary policy is not the right tool for inflation, period. So at least in the United States, there has been a narrative that's been built that the current inflation we're seeing is a problem of too much demand. And where is this demand coming from? It's because the government added too much stimulus to the economy during COVID. We gave stimulus checks to people. That was way too much. Obviously, all of the focus is on the stimulus checks that went to households. We don't hear a lot about all the money that went to businesses, although a lot of the spending of the government that went to businesses. But that's been the narrative, that it's a problem of too much demand, and we have to rein in demand to solve our inflation problem. But even when you look at the economy, I think a different picture emerges. It's a picture of an economy where demand has recovered to the pre-pandemic levels, and it has recovered rather quickly compared to our previous situations. But it's not a situation of too much demand, even by mainstream standards, I would say, because, you know, a mainstream economist and a post-Keynesian can look at the same economy and they can see different levels of slack, right? You know, somebody like me who does MMT would look at the economy where the unemployment rate is, say, 3.5%, and I would say we can still push it even lower and not necessarily get inflation pressures. It's just about the kind of policy we do. But even going by mainstream standards, right? Is the economy overheating, and is that the reason why we have inflation? So one way to look at this would be to look at potential GDP versus actual GDP, and this is all in nominal terms. So initially, when the pandemic started, the Congressional Budget Office, which comes up with these estimates of potential GDP, because that's what they are, they're estimates, they're not observables. And so they revised their estimates downward because of the expectation that we were going to have this huge downturn. And in downturns, our economy's potential gets eroded because we basically don't use the potential. And so it gets eroded that way. But then they quickly revised them upward, and they kept revising them upward, right? Because of the kind of recovery that we had, which was stronger, which I would attribute to the strong fiscal policy response. And so if you look at these numbers, only in the second quarter of 2022 is when our actual GDP went above the potential GDP, and that wasn't by that much, right? And obviously inflation had started way before that, right? So if the argument is that we've reached our economy's potential, right, we are spending more than the economy can accommodate, then you should have started seeing inflation pressure starting in, you know, the middle of 2022. But obviously inflation started way before that. And so even by this measure, we hadn't reached our economy's potential until sometime in 2022. Now, just because we reach the economy's potential doesn't necessarily mean we have to see inflation. And this graph actually showcases that very well. So I have the potential GDP, which is the blue line, and then actual GDP, which is the red line. And on the right-hand scale, I'm measuring inflation, the inflation rate, which is the consumer price index, basically, the change in the consumer price index year over year. And we can see that we had this long period, right? This was leading up to the global financial crisis, where we had our, we had reached our potential GDP, and we were even over it to some extent for quite a while. And our inflation was hovering around 3%. We weren't seeing this runaway, 7, 8, 9% inflation that we are seeing today. And it picked up here because we had the commodity speculation. So basically, when the housing market crashed, a lot of the money that was in the housing market moved to the commodity market and inflated the commodities futures. That's why we saw that spike in inflation. And then there was the very quick downturn, and then inflation stayed very subdued in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So just because we are getting close to potential GDP doesn't mean we necessarily have to see price pressures. And this is the story that we're getting from mainstream economists, right? People like Larry Summers, Jason Furman, basically saying we stimulated the economy too much, got to the potential level, overheated, and that's why we're seeing inflation pressures. Even before COVID, right, we were very close to our potential. We had gotten there. And the result was not the runaway inflation that we are seeing today. One other thing I would say here is that you can also see that this blue line, right, how its trend went, changed in a downward because we did not do appropriate and adequate policy measures in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and during the Great Recession. Instead, we engaged in austerity here, and obviously it was worse in the UK and the Eurozone, and that has depressed our economy's potential. So in a way, the lesson that I'm seeing from these two recessions is not that we should not overdo fiscal policy because we're going to get inflation. It's more like if you don't do sufficient, then you are lowering your economy's potential and setting it up for inflationary pressures down the line. And I'm happy to answer questions on this if I'm being too technical here. Now, the other story we're getting is that the labor market is too tight, right? And that's evidenced by the low unemployment rate. But of course, the unemployment rate is not the whole story. What I have here is the labor force participation rate. Basically, this tells us what percentage of the population that's eligible to be in the labor force is either working or is unemployed and looking for a job, right? So we look at how much the population, let's say 16 and over, that's not in prisons, that's not in institutions of any sort, that is participating in the labor force. And what we've been seeing since the 1970s in the US is this gradual decline in labor force participation rate. And obviously this drop since the global financial crisis is quite significant. And what we see is that we never recovered, right? Our economy never recovered back. So the people who left the labor force, they left it basically for good, quite a lot of them stayed out. And then we had this very big drop in the aftermath of COVID, and we have recovered, but we are not even at the pre-pandemic levels, right? So we haven't even gotten back to those levels. I'm not even talking about this pre-global financial crisis levels, right? So there is still more room to coax more workers into the labor market, right? And for that, we need to make sure that the recovery continues, that labor market stays strong, right? Which is obviously not the policy choice that we are taking. That's not the policy route we're taking right now. The other graph that I wanted to show you, which kind of also tells the story that we are not having a problem of too much demand, is this graph from the Atlanta Federal Reserve Business Expectations Survey. So instead of surveying Wall Street people and economists to try to gauge what the inflation expectations are, they're actually surveying non-financial businesses, large and small, and they're asking them a bunch of questions like, how do your sales compare to the norm, right? And when you look at that, you see that businesses are not reporting sales that are above the norm, right? And then one of the questions they're getting asked is, what's going to be the influence of sales in the future on prices? And we can see that hasn't been above the norm in the aftermath of the pandemic. And in fact, that value is actually going down right now, right? So even if you could make the case that we had a problem of too much demand earlier after the pandemic, that has all played out, right? So you can't say that we are going to continue to see too much demand to the extent that the fiscal stimulus was contributing to the demand. That has all played out in the United States, at least. All right. Now, what is driving the current inflation? I think there are many factors that are contributing to it, and I would say they're mostly on the supply side. So this is the breakdown of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, by major component. And I think Isabella is going to talk about one of these components in particular. You don't have to be able to read the legend to tell me which one is the green bar, right? It's obvious that it's transportation. It's obvious that a lot of it is oil. Some of it is car prices, which is related to the shortage of semiconductors and so on. So clearly, this is a story of particular bottlenecks. And the other line that is the other bar that is quite noticeable is this yellow one right here, and that's rentals, right? But it's not actual rentals. The actual rentals are this gray bars that are, still significant somewhat, but they're not as important as the yellow ones. And the yellow is what we call imputed rentals for housing. So these are not actual prices, these are imputed prices. And what's done is that, the question is, if you're owning your own home, like I do, for instance, how much would I pay to rent the kind of house that I currently own, right? So this is for owner-occupied homes. People who own their homes, the question is, if they were to rent that kind of home, how much would they pay for it, right? Obviously, this is not a good reflection of how much I'm actually paying, because my mortgage has been fixed ever since I got the house, right? So, say 10 years ago. So this is not an actual price that people are paying. This is just the price that we would be paying if we were to rent homes of, the kinds of homes that we have bought and we live in. So in some sense, you can see that this unobservable price is quite an important part of the price index, and it's been driving the current inflation, the high readings of inflation as well. All right. But I think, to me, the main story here is that this is a problem of oil. And if you look at the oil markets, is it a question of too much demand? Is it a question of too little supply? I think it's a little bit of both, right? So again, to me, it seems like the demand has recovered and the supply has not been able to recover, at least in the US, right? We are only now getting to the pre-pandemic levels of oil supply. And obviously, we can see that OPEC is a big part of this story, right? It was a big part of the story in the US in the 1970s when we had the inflationary episode, and it's still a big part of the story today. So, we haven't taken, we didn't do it right in the 1970s, the policy of, say, transitioning away from oil. And it seems like we haven't learned those lessons, and we're still not doing the right thing here. All right. So, the story, to me, is a supply side story, right? It's a story of a pandemic that started as a supply side crisis, morphed into demand, and we have the policy tools to affect demand. And as an MMT economist, I would say we can finance demand in unlimited amounts, so money is not a problem. The problem is the real resources, right? So do we have enough real resources? And that's where the supply comes in. So the first round of COVID relief that we did in the US, the fiscal stimulus, or fiscal relief, I should say, it wasn't really stimulus. It helped people pay their bills, pay their debts. It also increased savings. So in a way, it was split in 3 equal parts. A third of it went to consumption, a third went to saving, and a third went to paying debts, basically. And then eventually the last round restored spending to the pre-COVID levels. But at the same time, we've continued to see supply side pressures, supply chain issues that companies have been facing. In that same survey that I talked about, the Atlanta Fed survey, when companies are asked about price, supply side disruptions, the majority of them were reporting supply side disruptions as late as the middle of 2022 still. And I think those things are still continuing. There's also the question of pricing, right? Prices don't just happen. They are set by corporations. And in the US, corporations tell their shareholders very clearly that they are using the cover of inflation to raise prices, right? They are actually saying that this is a great time for our pricing decisions, right? We can basically take advantage of the situation because there is inflation and nobody's going to single us out as, oh, look at this one company that's raising their prices, right? So they are using this as an opportunity to raise their prices. There's also the issue of course, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions and so on. And that's going to be a bigger part of the story in Europe, I would say. And that's why I think we're seeing higher inflationary pressures in a place like Germany, right, compared even to the United States. So it's not a story of wages driving this, right? It's not a story of wage price spiral. Wages are just playing catch up at this point. And so early on, I basically was of the opinion that this inflationary episode was transitory. And I'm still of that opinion that it's transitory, even though I think it's taking longer than I initially thought it was going to take. And that's because in the US, workers don't really have the power to force firms to compensate them fully for the inflation that they're facing. In fact, real wages have actually, not been catching up, right? So they have decreased in real terms. The pay has. All right. So I'm going to speed up because I think I'm already at that 15-minute mark. So the question then is, what do we do about it, right? What can central banks do about this inflation or inflation in general? In the US, the Fed basically held off for as long as they could, but then they were under strong pressure from economists in particular, saying that the Fed has to do something about it. If it doesn't do it, the inflation cat is going to be out of the bag and there's no way we're going to put it back in. The Fed was called too soft on inflation. Larry Summers, who was not a part of the administration, trying to sort of influence policy from outside, urging the Fed to keep raising rates, or the argument was that it should have started earlier and it should have raised them faster, stuff like that, right? And the Fed eventually sort of obliged, and now they are on a path of interest rate increases, right? Which I think is not going to end very well. The Fed, of course, so economists are definitely to blame for this, and I'll get to that in just a moment again. But the Fed is also to blame because they have taken credit for the low inflation in the US, so they've been happy to take credit for it, which I think has been unjustified to a great extent. The story is that supposedly Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, broke the back of inflation in the 1980s. The reality was that he raised interest rates, above 20% and caused a deep recession and financial crisis, not just in the US, but also abroad, something that we're again seeing happening right now or is potentially going to happen. They also broke labor unions, right? That's what happened during Reagan. They broke labor unions, they broke the air traffic controller strike, and something we're seeing right now in the US play out as well, as the strike of railroad workers is being broken again. So the reality, I think, is that first, labor unions lost their power, and we also had this, and a related issue was the globalized supply chains, the outsourcing, the cheap labor abroad. We also had this just-in-time production, largely driven by Wall Street, where companies were trying to squeeze every last bit of profit by trying to keep their costs low, labor costs and otherwise. We've also had a fiscal policy that's been too tight over the last few recoveries. So we've had stagnating demand and austerity. We had austerity in the middle of a recession, basically, after the global financial crisis. And so we've had these jobless recoveries where wage pressures have not materialized, right? The labor market has been too weak. And so that's really what's kept prices low. And if the Fed has had any role in all of this, it's been to preemptively raise interest rates to prevent tight labor markets and to prevent wage growth. That's been the role of the Fed. And they say it. If you look at the Fed minutes, they basically say it, that's what they look at. They look at the labor market. Once it gets too tight, they are going to jump in and start raising interest rates. Now, as I said, economists and economics has a role to play here, obviously, and economics has been a terrible guide for monetary policy and for the Fed. The Fed has abandoned the quantity theory, the monetarist idea that we have to control money supply to fight inflation. It's arguable to what extent they really embraced that idea. Some economic historians have argued that it was really sort of a cover for raising interest rates to 20% and saying, well, we're not doing that. We're just controlling the money supply and interest rates are where they are. And the current approach is this approach of the new monetary consensus, that the expectations of inflation cause inflation. Not clear how. And that policy works by controlling expectations, right? That monetary policy, our main approach for controlling inflation is about basically controlling the expectations of inflation of the market. And so Fed economist Jeremy Rudd wrote this very good paper a few years ago where he basically said the Fed has no working theory of inflation. Even Fed officials have basically said that. My co-author Randall Wray and Dimitri Papadimitriou wrote a paper in 1994 saying the Fed is flying blind. And they recently wrote an update of that saying that the Fed is still flying blind. They have really no way of, they have no adequate theory of inflation. So this graph shows you the inflation expectations, long-term and short-term. And this is the actual inflation, right? So instead of expectations driving inflation, it's more like expectations eventually converge to reality, right? Expectations of inflation change when the actual inflation rates change. So this, right, could not have caused that. And that's basically the Fed's theory, that the expectations of inflation cause inflation. And that's just not what we're seeing in reality. And this is the Fed actively trying to control inflation, like raising rates, and that's the orange line here. It's the federal funds rate or the overnight rate, and this is actual inflation, which, it's like active Fed is fighting inflation. What is it that they're fighting? So I will conclude by saying that the reality of using monetary policy to fight inflation is what MMT economists have been saying for quite some time, and post-Keynesians too, obviously, is that the Fed is using unemployment as a tool to fight inflation. And the only good thing to come out of this episode is that they are actually openly admitting that, right? Here is Jerome Powell saying that there will likely be some softening of the labor market conditions, but we will keep at it until we're confident the job is done. And it's interesting that he uses the word "we will keep at it." That's like the title of Paul Volcker's book, that keeping at it, something like that, that he kept at it, that despite all the pressure, right, from labor, from other parts of the government and so on, they kept at it and they got inflation under control. Again, Powell says the labor market is just very, very, very strong, right? And I would argue that's not what we're seeing in the data. Here is the chair of the Boston Fed that says, I do anticipate that accomplishing price stability will require slower employment growth and a somewhat higher unemployment rate. In fact, the Fed forecasts the unemployment rate to rise from 4.4 to 5% next year, right? So that's the price. That's the price to pay for getting inflation supposedly under control. All right. So I'll just jump to my conclusion in the interest of time. I think it's time that we rethink inflation, and we also rethink how we fight it. The current inflation is not really demand driven, and to the extent that monetary policy can do anything about inflation, it's not about expectations, it's really about just lowering aggregate demand, right? It can't solve our supply problems, so the only thing it can do is to try to tighten demand, and that's what we're doing. And all of this happens as fiscal tightening is happening, right? We have our president basically saying our deficit is going down. That's a great thing, but the deficit is going down. It means fiscal policy is getting tighter, right? So fiscal policy is getting tighter, and we're tightening monetary policy, and I think that's a recipe for a recession. And so we have to rethink how we fight inflation, and we have to give a bigger role to fiscal policy, because fiscal policy can actually address the bottlenecks. It can address the issue of housing and lack of housing. It can issue the issue of oil causing a bottleneck by, say, investing in alternative energies. We can try to help households who are struggling in the current inflationary environment. Again, the Fed cannot do it. It has to be done through fiscal policy. And obviously, fiscal policy is also done in a democratic manner, which is not how monetary policy is done. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Yeva. That was fantastic. Thank you. That was great. I really recommend you to check out Yeva's papers on our website. I think what's very interesting is not only Yeva's paper doesn't only show us how complex to understand the factors behind inflation is, but also depending on your theoretical and methodological starting point, you go to different venues and you may miss some of these factors, which is very important as well. So please check out that paper. So, okay, so Isabella, you're next.
Great. Thank you so much for setting this up. I think that Yeva's paper and my paper actually speak to one another perfectly, so I can just kind of pick up where she ended, which is exciting. So the title of my presentation is Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies, Systemically Significant Prices from an Input-Output Perspective. Some of you might have seen that I got very heavily criticized when I suggested pretty much exactly about a year ago that we might have to start thinking about specific methods to tackle the price increases that are happening in specific sectors, and that this might involve us to have to go back to the tool of targeted price controls, which we have been kind of abandoned to the dustbin of history for a while, but that might become relevant again. Now, a year on, some of the same people who criticized me at the time have actually been recommending price controls in the context of war in Europe. And I find myself just being about to conclude work on a German government commission where we have been designing gas price caps. And I can talk about the specificities of this policy because it's a very kind of complex type of arrangement. But I think that the notion that we might need to do something about specific prices is by now much more acceptable than it was a year ago. And I think that the reason for this is in parts that, at least in the European context, it's now very clear that there is a very serious emergency. There's war in Europe in a way in which it hasn't been in a long time. And this has huge economic implications, in particular for energy markets, in ways that require new kinds of economic policy tools. Now, what I'm arguing in this paper is that, yes, the situation in Europe is very dramatic. The pandemic was very dramatic, but this idea that we are just about to return to some state of normal tranquility seems very charming and tempting. And I hope it is the case that the war will be over soon, that the pandemic will stop looming and will actually be eventually, that we will have a true victory that really is a global victory, that we get climate change under control, that we do not have any more extreme weather events, that we do not have any more shocks from climate change and so on. My sense is that chances are there are more shocks in the pipeline because we are living in a world of overlapping emergencies, so that the kind of shocks to supply that we have been observing in the last 2 years or so are likely to reoccur in some fashion or another. We don't really know how they're going to happen. We don't really know where they're going to hit, but it seems likely enough that there might be more shocks to come, which is the reason why I am arguing for a form of economic disaster preparedness. No one wants a disaster to happen, but it's better to be prepared than to have a disaster happen without being prepared. So as I think became already very clear in Yeva's presentation, we have been thinking of monetary policy a little bit like this coin-based horse. So kind of going back and forth in a very regular kind of fashion. It's pretty one-dimensional if you think about it. It's like basically one dimension that you care about. There are different dimensions that different people emphasize. Some emphasize more the quantity of money. Some emphasize more the potential GDP in relation to the actual GDP. Others might be stressing more the question of expectations, but it's in general like kind of a one-dimensional question where you have a one-dimensional tool, which is raising interest rates, which supposedly is enough to get monetary stability for the economy as a whole. With this mindset comes an understanding where changes in relative prices have nothing to do with inflation. Milton Friedman, as of course a figurehead of monetarism, put this very explicitly in the context of the inflation of the 1970s, when he said, "What of oil and food, to which every government official has pointed in relationship to the inflation then, are they not the obvious immediate cause of the price explosion? Not at all. It is essential to distinguish changes in relative prices from changes in absolute prices. The special conditions that drove up the prices of oil and food required purchasers to spend more on them, leaving less to spend on other items. Did that not force other prices to go down or to rise less rapidly than otherwise? Why should the average level of oil prices be affected significantly by changes in the prices of some things relative to others?" So here then, these changes in relative prices have at the very best a transitory impact on the macroeconomy, and that period of transition is so short that it really doesn't matter because people spend less on other items if they're spending more on some items, which means that overall the price level will stay constant. Now, this is of course the exact opposite of the idea that specific price shocks might matter for inflation. I'm going to skip over this because Yeva already covered this brilliantly. So what I'm arguing in this paper is that because we are living in this world of overlapping emergencies where we have intense shocks to specific prices that change relative prices, and that because these shocks can be so intense that they can in fact unsettle the general price level, we have to think about price stabilization more like the ways in which we think about riding an actual horse, which is we want to be prepared, we want to understand what triggers our horse, we want to be wearing a helmet, we want to be as safe as we can because we prepare for our ride. The logic that we are using in this paper actually builds on input-output analysis, and input-output analysis was first formalized in the context of the Second World War, when one of the pressing questions was how to bomb the German economy in the most effective kind of way. And they wanted to understand what are the points in the economic system that if those points collapse, the whole economy stops working. This was a question of strategic bombing. Now, what we are doing in this paper is kind of using the same type of method to see what are the points of the greatest vulnerability today, where if shocks hit these kind of sectors, this has the potential to unsettle price stability for the economy as a whole. This requires us to think of the economy as a circular flow, as Leontiev was arguing. So in input-output analysis, we use a method of systemically quantifying the mutual interrelationships among the various sectors of a complex economic system, which means that we can trace the effect of an event at any one point and the ways in which it is transmitted to the rest of the economy step by step via the chain of transactions that links the whole system together. This also means that in sharp contrast to Milton Friedman's notion, far from being independent of each other, the cost-price structures of all the separate industries are nothing but links in a vast network which embraces the whole national economy. This means that we are taking the overall dependence among wage rates, profits earned, and taxes as the starting point for our analysis, where someone's prices are always someone else's costs, which means that costs and prices across sectors are interrelated. In fact, we can find a statement by Leontiev from the same year as the Milton Friedman statement that claims the exact opposite of what Milton Friedman was saying. As Leontiev put it, as a matter of fact, the problem of inflation cannot be dealt with in aggregative terms either. If you had inflation in which all prices and incomes move in parallel, nobody would care. Actual inflation is a change in relative prices, not just in the average price level. And as a matter of fact, we can find similar statements also in Keynes. If we think of inflation as a matter of changes in relative prices, this means that this is important because it has immediate redistributive implications. This is built on the assumption that there's a downward stickiness of prices, which means that if one price goes up, it does not mean that another price immediately goes up by the amount to keep the average constant. From this perspective, then, higher levels of inflation can follow from shocks to important sectors that matter in the network of costs and prices, and these shocks can be an expression of political events like wars, climate disaster, speculative hikes, and so on. The research question that we are addressing in this paper is if inflation is not always and everywhere a macroeconomic phenomenon, as the current mainstream would have it, but can be unleashed by micro shocks on the supply side, we need to identify which sectors present points of vulnerability for monetary stability, or in other words, have the greatest potential to become systemically significant for inflation. So a bit like with the exercise in strategic bombing, you want to understand what are the points of the greatest vulnerability. If those points are being hit, you want to understand how this percolates through the whole system. In our empirical analysis, we first build a Leontiev price model, then we simulate the inflation impact of a price shock to each of the 71 sectors in our input-output economy, one at a time. This is to say, we simulate what happens if there's a shock to the first sector, then we do the same for the second, the third, until we get to the 71st. And in terms of the magnitude of the shock, we first use the average price volatilities as they were observed before the pandemic. And then secondly, we use the actual price movements in the COVID-19 pandemic, breaking this up into what I'm calling the post-shutdown economy in 2021 and the economy during the Russian war on Ukraine. This then allows us to rank the sectors by their inflation impact, and this is, as we argue, is a way to identify through the first exercise using the volatilities which sectors are latently systemically significant. That is to say, they have the potential to become the sectors that unleash overall inflation, or B, those sectors that actually realize systemic significance during the COVID-19 inflation. I have a chart here to explain what an input-output table is in case that is not familiar to the audience. I'll skip over it in the interest of time for now. Basically, what we do in this model is that we take the value of the output of each industry, which is composed of the value of domestic inputs, so all the stuff that an industry buys from other industries, value added, which is profits, wages, and taxes, and the imports that an industry buys from abroad, that is imported inputs. We then divide this value of the output of an industry by the total output of this industry, which it gives us the prices per unit of output. And this is important. The price here then is composed of the value of domestic inputs plus the value added plus the imported inputs, which we can again solve for prices, which then gives us an equation where every price of every industry is interrelated to the prices of all other industries. This allows us to decompose the shocks that we are simulating into direct inflation impacts. That is the change that a specific price change induces in the CPI, in the consumer baskets, and the indirect inflation impact, which comes through the impact of that price change on all other industries. So if you take the example of oil, the price of fertilizers will change. If the price of fertilizers changes, the price of wheat will change. The price of wheat changes, the price of bread will change. So at the end of the day, you have a pretty big indirect impact of the change in the price of oil on overall inflation. And we combine this direct and the indirect inflation impact to come up with a measure of total inflation impact. And then we rank the sectors based on this total inflation impact, which we use to identify systemically significant prices. This chart is intentionally such that you cannot read it. I just want you to look at the shape of these figures. These are the rankings that we get of the sectoral inflation, total inflation impact. And you can see that it's very unevenly distributed. In other words, some sectors clearly matter much more than others. So if we zoom into this and we look at the latent systemic significance, which is composed of a direct effect and an indirect effect, as I've just explained, where these green points indicate the magnitude of the price volatility from 2000 to 2019. We find that the most important sectors from the perspective of the pre-pandemic world are petroleum and coal products, oil and gas extraction, farms, food and beverage and tobacco products, then the Federal Reserve banks, which is a weird industry in an input-output setting, which is why I'm discarding it, and I can explain in more detail why. Then we have chemical products, housing, utilities, wholesale trade, and other retail. Other retail is kind of a basket case, so I'm also discarding this. This leaves us with 8 industries which show up as systemically significant, and all of these 8 industries appear again on the top of the ranking when we use the actual price changes as they occurred in the post-shutdown economy, that is Q4 2021, and when we use the price shocks as they occurred in the second quarter of 2022, so the time when the war in Ukraine was already in full swing. That's not the right terminology to use here, sorry, but it was already happening. I think I'm kind of, okay, in the interest of time, I'm also going to skip over this and just point out that we basically have 3 groups of systemically significant sectors, The first one is basic necessities, that is housing, food, farms, utilities, petroleum and gas products. The second one is basic production inputs, such as petroleum and gas products, again, oil and gas extraction and chemical products, but also basics of circulation, such as wholesale trade and truck transportation, which is a sector that only shows up in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would argue it's a specific sector that had specific bottlenecks, but that is related to oil and gas at the end of the day. We also do a similar kind of exercise where we do not assume, as we did in the baseline model that I just showed you, that profits and wages just stay what they were before the shock, but that now workers can actually regain their real wage by increasing their nominal wage in ways to compensate for the price increases for the stuff that they are buying, or that businesses can increase their profits in a way that compensate for the decreased profit margins from increased costs. This is what we call conflict inflation, based on Rawson's important work of the 1970s. If we run these simulations, we find that the ranking of systemically significant sectors stays pretty much the same. But we can also see that with basically the exception of oil and gas extraction, in all cases, this line is going up more between the second and the third model, which is the change from the profit adjustment to the wage adjustment. This means that we would need a larger wage adjustment to compensate for the price increases than the magnitude of the profit adjustment that we would need to compensate for the price increases. In other words, this means that if there is no such wage adjustment, real wages are hit harder than profit margins by these shocks to systemically significant prices, or in other words, workers are carrying the brunt of these shocks. In conclusion, then, we can say that if price shocks become systemic because we are living in overlapping emergencies, it is not feasible to react with rate hikes each time a sector is hit by a shock because of the reasons that Yeva has laid out for us. Economic stabilization then requires a form of disaster preparedness to absorb shocks in systemically significant sectors. This requires a change in mindset and requires monitoring capacity for these systemically significant sectors, as well as institutions and laws for emergency price management, which can involve buffer stocks, regulation of financial speculation, which is important for the whole commodity sector, prohibition of price gouging in times of emergencies, antitrust measures, limits to price hikes, investments to increase the medium-term resilience, and a standby authority for emergency price stabilization in systemically significant sectors. If systemically significant sectors are so important that they can unsettle the economy as a whole, this also raises the question whether the public doesn't need more of a say in these sectors, just as central banks were once private in history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabella. So needless to say, that's another paper, another work, you should check it out. You may think that all this indirect impact of prices is like straightforward, or the connection among sectors, but most of the analysis don't really get into that level. It's not even a level of detail, right? Don't get into that approach, that don't develop the analysis from that perspective. Okay, so we have our final speaker, Torsten, in person.
I'm slightly nervous because I'm not qualified, obviously, to talk about this because I've never ridden a horse. I'm also slightly shell-shocked by the reminder that Americans had their mortgages fixed for the lifetime of their mortgages, which everyone in the US, in the UK, who does not have that pleasure is about to be, as I'll come on to later, smacked round the head for the next few years by rising mortgage bills. But anyway, so I thought I would cope with all that trauma by, I don't want to repeat a lot of the discussion on the macroeconomics of the current crisis, so I'll touch on that a bit at the end. But I thought I'd do something much simpler, which is what is the impact, what's going on in the UK, which isn't the same as going on in the US. What is the impact on people and different kinds of people of that shock, and what might we think comes next, broadly, as three things to cover. So I'll try and do that, and I'll try and do that reasonably quickly, maybe not covering all of this. Right, we've actually got some slides that are working. Right, okay, so this tells you the obvious, you all know this. We've seen the highest inflation rate in 40 years. We've also seen the fastest increase in the inflation rate in 40 years. So it's not just that this has turned up, it's turned up as a complete surprise. If I'd shown you forecast, this is the Bank of England, the OBR's latest forecast from last month, but if I'd shown you all the forecasts that started from this time last year going backwards, they all basically look like 2% stretching into the horizon with a nice straight line, so it's always nice to be surprised. In life, the same thing would be true if I showed you Fed forecasts for the United States too. So that's the big thing you all know. This is then covering some of the similar ground to charts you've seen. So again, I'm not going to dwell on it other than to say, for the UK, I think, again, this is one reason why the UK and most European countries are obviously very different to the US, not if you consider the Eurozone as a whole, which is, we're talking here about pretty small but very open economies, right? One. Two, the gas price issue is a much bigger deal in Europe, much bigger deal in Europe than it is in the States, because we don't produce it, obviously. Thirdly, for consumers, it's a bigger deal in the UK because not only do we use gas for heating our homes, we use gas for generating electricity to a much greater extent than most European countries. And these things really matter when you come to, as you say, how do individual prices feed through to wider inflation metrics. So this is telling you broadly what you probably already know. So you've got two broad things going on the international side of things. Here we've got basically energy-related costs at the bottom pushing up. We've then got other goods, and I'm putting that there because most of those are internationally traded to some degree or other. Some of the services are in the green basket too, and a lot of that is relating to, as I'm going to come back to, some of the questions about what US demand has been versus what other countries' demand has been during this phase. But broadly what I'm saying to you is, in terms of the inflation rate we're seeing today in the UK, stay away from the macro row about whether you need to raise rates, but in terms of what we're seeing today, it's definitely driven by international goods, and in particular, obviously, energy costs. Right, then just a footnote on the macro debate before we move on, which is just to say, all of the economics debate is dominated by the United States. That's because all economics debates are dominated by the United States. If you hadn't got used to that yet and you've chosen a career in economics, you've chosen the wrong career. It's not going to go away anytime soon. But this is just showing you that the big phenomenon that's sitting behind the row that the other two speakers have excellently covered in the United States on the causes of inflation, which is broadly, is it being driven because people had too much money and they have spent it basically on buying loads of goods, and in particular durable goods? We mean here cars and leisure goods. Right, they bought every ukulele you can find in the US. Every bit of sports kit has, I don't know how people are doing so much sport, but anyway, they bought a lot of sports kit, okay, and they've kept doing it, slightly against all my expectations, whereas services spending is down below its longer term trend. So they've switched from services spending into large amounts of durable and into goods spending. That's the row about whether that is a demand problem, people had too much money, or that is a supply problem, they couldn't get the stuff they wanted to buy, is obviously a large part of what's going on. All I'm really saying to you here is, whatever your view is on that debate, that is not what's going on in the UK, because everything's a turkey. Okay, so like, everyone's spending is down significantly from its pre-pandemic path. You can see a switch from services, light blue, into goods, green, during the pandemic, because any of you who was in the UK during the pandemic? You'll have noticed you couldn't buy any, you couldn't go out and have a nice time, right? So you all bought rubbish for your home. In the UK, it was like DIY kit because they're so upset about what was going to happen to you might as well have a nice house if you're going to pay your mortgage, right? So they all went and bought DIY stuff in the UK. But again, the overall level of spending is significantly below what you would have been expecting. If I could show you the same chart with income levels, it would show you a similar pattern, right? Okay, so it's not the same thing. Most European countries' version of this chart looks more like the UK than it looks like the US. So the US is a really special case to some degree and is totally dominating this inflation debate. So stop it, this is my polite way of saying that, okay? Right, then moving on to what does this all mean for actual people, because that's what we, in the end, should be focused on. The first thing is, it's really, really bad in terms of what is happening to household incomes. This is showing you income growth This is national accounts measures of income growth. If anyone wants to talk about different measures, you get slightly different results. But broadly, this is showing you income growth for households over the annualized. And basically, it's telling you over the 2 years, so the year we're just about to end and next year, we're seeing about a 7% fall in household incomes. That is something like £1,700 per household. That is, as you can see, not normal. Even in very deep recessions, 1980s, financial crisis, you don't see income falls that big. Okay. Now, if I showed you the same chart of GDP, what you would see obviously is really big falls of GDP in the pandemic, like really big. Obviously, we shut down half the economy, so we weren't producing anything. But income didn't fall because government support basically stepped in. You couldn't get income from GDP, so you got income from the state, right? In lots of cases, furlough, big increase in benefits happening at the same time. What's now happened is that we're now projecting a shallow-ish recession, but very deep falls in household incomes. I think that's what's really important to understand about what's going on. And the reason that's going on is because the country's got poorer. So that's because for the UK, we don't produce hardly any hydrocarbons. There's a reason why the climate change transition is harder in the US than the UK. We haven't got anyone to put out of work, and we haven't got to shut down any gas fields, really. But in the US, they do. And so the result, though, for us is we just get a lot poorer when you get an energy price shock. And so we're importing that. And so basically one way of thinking about all the political economy of the current phase of British politics is we're just deciding how we get poorer and who and when, right? That's what a strike is. That's what a strike is. That's what raising taxes or cutting spending is. And all of that is about power politics, and it decides who pays and when they pay. So it's a big deal, is what I'm saying. This is the equivalent of a very deep recession happening, and it's happening this year and next. It's not the same for everybody. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but just to briefly cap, this is showing you poorest households on the left, richest households on the right. What is their inflation rate, given what we know is differences in consumption baskets for different kinds of households, and then apply exactly the same CPI methodology, but to those different consumption baskets. And it's basically telling you what you should know, which is poorer households obviously consume energy is a much bigger part of their consumption basket than it is for middle-income households and richer households, and so is food. And food and energy are doing a lot of the work in this round of inflation, and which is giving us this basically record gap between the inflation paid by the richest households. Some bits of what's going on right now are really bad for richer households. So richer households drive a lot more. So petrol prices are actually pretty top heavy, but petrol prices have come down a bit in a way that gas prices and therefore household energy prices haven't. Okay. So first of all, poor households much harder hit. The balance between energy and food is quite unusual. So if you look back at the previous rounds, usually, despite what people say, inflation rates are quite similar for different income groups over long periods of time, generally, in the UK. The exceptions in the recent past for you to have in your head are before the financial crisis, when we were busy buying banks. I can remember a phase of like 6 months where rice prices, I don't know if anyone remembers this, there was a rice price disaster going on. It was basically a food price problem, but it was more rice-based and less wheat-based, which is what we've got going on now. This may sound, someone's looking like, why is he talking about rice and wheat at the back? Anyway, it's a reasonable question, but I'm going to finish the point now. There was a big problem on that, and that does have big distribution effects. So different countries consume different things. I haven't got a chart in here on pasta prices, I promise, but different countries consume different kinds of food, and different groups and that was consume different kinds of food. And that was a big problem in that phase. You saw a big stretching of what poorer and richer households. And then we saw the same thing in 2012, 2013, which was the last energy price shock. Yeah, that was very small compared to this one, but that's the last time. So those are the times when we see poorer households being harder hit, when those are the things driving. And you'll notice those are all imported for the UK, those are all imported prices. Right, I'll just briefly say that older households are also facing a higher inflation rate. This is our own work using the same methodologies I've just shown you, showing you 80 older households. That's because older households don't spend very much apart from heating. Okay. Now you might not feel that sorry for them because they've got like 5 bedrooms per person, okay, and all the rest. So they can, but that is part of what is going on. Older households in the UK have not only do they have much bigger houses, they have much leakier houses, and they don't spend any other money, right? So they have high. But older households in general are being harder hit by what is going on right now. So Isabella touched on this, but policy is like, despite everyone saying the Fed is doing all the work. The Fed is obviously doing the work insofar as being, and the Bank of England, in dealing with inflation in the longer term perspective. But in almost all countries, but definitely in all big European countries, Fiscal policy is doing shed loads of work, right? And so is regulatory policy. And this is just to touch on some of the elements. So this chart is showing you, again, poorer households on the left, richer households on the right, the levels and the distribution of fiscal support to households this year, 22-23 in blue, and next year, 23-24 in red, okay? Because we now know what the government support package is notionally going to be for next year, fingers crossed, unless energy prices don't come down. And what it's telling you is two things. In 22-23, everybody got quite a lot of support. So this is like energy price guarantee, capping all energy bills at £2,500, checks for the poorer households, and universal payments that get delivered through the energy bill system. So you get those of you not paying your energy bills, you get £400 off your energy bill per household if you're doing that. Everyone does, whatever their income. So you've got a pretty universalist system, and you've got it, and it's pretty big. It's been done really messily. Obviously, it was not a good way to do it, but forget all the micro stuff. It's big. There's a large amount of cash per household. Then you've got what's happening next year, where we've got a more progressive, significantly more progressive system, but it's much less generous. So now, next year, about 2/3 will go to the bottom half, whereas broadly the bottom half only got about half. This year, this is mainly made up of £900 payments going to each household on means-tested benefits, or for some older households, and then it's the energy price guarantee, capping prices at £3,000, the equivalent of £3,000 for a typical energy user from April, up from the current 2,500. Okay. Now, and obviously, if energy prices end up being higher, then this red bar would go up because we'd be capping up. The cost of that cap would rise. Okay. Now, what I would take away from this is that energy price cap obviously is affecting what the actual measured CPI is, right? But it's not going to affect. It's not going to affect what the actual inflationary pressure is. We're just deciding whether the state's bearing it or the individual is bearing it. That's what I'm saying to you. We're deciding who's getting poorer, how we're getting poorer. The other thing is, I haven't got it in the slide here, but is the system we're using for capping retail energy prices via the energy price cap, which other countries are doing other versions of. So the French went in very heavy early on. We're going to cap these price rises. In brackets, we won't talk about it very much, but we're going to suck up the cost of that with inside a nationalised energy sector until we don't want to suck it up anymore, and then we'll start letting it happen. But you can use regulatory policies to cap energy prices, to stop wholesale prices flowing through, or you can let the wholesale prices flow through, and then you can use straightforward fiscal policy to let them to help people deal with those prices, right? And that is, in the end, that's why it's really important from a household's perspective. This isn't just about interest rates. These policies make a huge, huge difference. And if wholesale prices stay where they are, next year's a disaster for this reason, right? Even if they just stay exactly where they are now, you've got to find an extra grand, right? And anyone that's met low income Britain knows they haven't got £1,000 just sitting around to pay for a higher energy bill. Right. Make the IT work. Right. Then, given though that there's lots of support, why does this all feel difficult for us to cope with? I just want to give you a reflection on why in Britain in particular we are not in a good position to deal with this crisis. And sitting behind this is a view which is Britain as a country with high inequality since the 1980s, not increasing recently, but high, highest inequality in a large European economy, plus a slow-growing economy. Okay, at least for the last 15 years, growing slower than our comparator economies. One of the effects of that, by far not the only one, is that the amount of our spending as households that goes on essentials has risen over time. And that's what this chart's showing you. So poorest households at the top, richest households at the bottom. In blue, we're showing the position in 2006, what percentage of people's budgets did they spend on essentials? And then we're showing you what it's changed to today. So the green is the more recent data. Okay, and we're saying, just focus, for example, on the top right, we're saying in 2006, under 52% of the budgets of the poorest households went on essentials, housing, energy, transport, things you can't really stop spending on to go through your life, food. And in 2019, it's over 58%. Okay. Now, the reason this matters when an energy price shock hits is because that's another increase in the cost of essential. But the way you cope when an essential price rises is you cut back on non-essential spending. But poorer households haven't got as much of that. Okay. Remember in the pandemic, why did rich households save loads of money? Because they couldn't go on posh holidays anymore, right? To a staggering extent. Whenever I look at data at what rich people spend on holidays, it's a lot of money, people. Like, it's more than you can possibly imagine. Even every time I discuss it with anyone, I'm like, I'm very tight, but they spend a lot of money. That's why they save so much. So these households, way of dealing with energy price shock is that they'll go on a slightly less posh holiday next summer, okay? These households are not going to be doing that, okay, because they don't have the margin adjustment. The same thing would be if I showed you exactly the same chart with savings. These people have savings, they can draw down on a temporary price shock. These people do not. Here's another way of thinking about this, which is from a survey that the ONS is now running almost weekly. I'm not sure why they're running it weekly, but they are. And it's showing you how people are responding to this energy price shock. Again, poorest households on the left, richest households on the right. This one is actually done by the deprivation of the area because they don't have full income data. But I think the pattern is broadly fair to compare. So for poorer households, 58% are already cutting back on food and other essentials because, as I've just shown you on the other chart, that's what they've got to cut back on. Everybody's having a tough time, so even a third of the top are cutting back on some of those. So even rich households are not having the heating on as much as they normally would, but 58% at the bottom. If you look at then who is investing in energy improvements for their home, who's doing it? Richer households, 35% are doing it, versus only 24% of households on the poor income. So the way that this shock translates into how people are able to cope is very different. The coping strategies that exist are different. You might be less worried about younger people because a load of them have just moved back in with their parents to cope with the shock. You might be more worried about them because they moved back in with their parents, and that is not what anyone should do. Now, unless they're Italian, can we just? Right, let's just briefly then go on to the future. So I'm going to start with the optimism, which is all else equal. There's a lot of, as Isabella was telling us just now, shocks will turn up, right? But all else equal, lots of the things that economists, particularly policy-oriented economists, have been worrying about for the last year look like they're easing. Okay, so lots of the things driving, particularly the like international imported part of the shock that's going on, the data's coming in a bit better than we might have expected. So I'm not going to go through all of them. We've got a paper coming out of this in the next few weeks, but this is showing you producer prices. So like input or output prices for what firms are actually doing, where you can see we're already past the peak of inflation. Hopefully that's good news for everybody. Come on. Here we go. Right. Secondly, as we were discussing earlier, inflation expectations are a large part of the anxiety. So why are central banks saying we've got to go really hard? Because they're saying, look, if inflation expectations get out of whack, then getting them back again will require really high unemployment. Whereas if we can keep the expectations down, we won't need to get unemployment as high without having a big discussion. That's what they're saying. Whether you agree with them or not, that's what they are doing. This is just showing you the inflation expectations. This is two different measures. Here you've got, the blue line is showing you firms' reported inflation expectations. What do they expect to happen a year ahead, starting to fall? In general, by the way, all inflation expectation measures just track actual inflation generally, so don't get overexcited. But the point is they're not shooting up to 10%, okay? And this is in red is showing you the household measure of inflation expectations. Again, looks like it may well have peaked, i.e. the Bank of England on that front may feel like they should be relaxing a bit more. Now, I think the danger is that we could easily spend, I think there's a serious danger that we spend the beginning of 2023 with everyone in economic policy world saying, oh, well, things are actually getting a bit better. Like, I'll give you another example. Like, the public finances for the UK will probably improve because interest rates we're being charged on our debt probably won't be quite as high as they were priced in this recent autumn statement. Probably save us quite a significant amount of money. So I think there's lots of areas where people will be like, oh, it's not quite as bad as we thought. It turns out German industry can cope with less gas than we thought it could, hopefully. I think the danger of that is that for households, that is not what's going to happen. Because the fact that things might be slightly less shit than you thought they were going to be doesn't help the fact that they're getting shitter. And that's what's going to be happening to households. So this is going to give you three ways of thinking about that. The first is showing you for unemployment. This is showing you the Bank of England in whatever that is, light purple, and the Office for Budget Responsibility, which for those of you not from the UK is our fiscal council, the kind of independent forecaster that does the government's forecasts that underpin our fiscal arithmetic, showing their expectations of quite big increases in unemployment next year, or over the next 18 months really. Now, the OBR is like, we're talking here about, it looks small in comparison, but we're talking 500,000 people, okay? The Bank of England's number is 1 million people. Now, again, in US terms, you can divide that, you can times that by 5 to get to the like rough impact we're talking about in terms of, so that's a lot of people. Now, that's a very concentrated effect. Most people won't lose their jobs, but for those that do, they have a very large effect. And remember, the UK welfare state doesn't protect their incomes if that happens to them, unless they're very low earning in the first place. Right, then we've got what I was starting with earlier on what's happening to people's mortgages, where in the UK, as I said, remember almost nobody has a fixed mortgage for the length of their term. Let's not go into the reasons why. What instead happens is that we have some people on variable mortgages, they're the blue bars, okay, who are already starting to see their mortgages rise with bank base rate. And then we've got the bigger population who have fixed term mortgages, but on very different terms. Sometimes 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, some lucky people on 10 years. They are over the course of the next 5 or 6 years going to be flowing over time as their current deal ends onto new deals, and those deals are going to have much higher interest rates, much higher. And as they do, to give you a sense, so the next election in the UK is the end of 2024, 5 million people, households I should say, will have seen their mortgage interest bills go up. We're not talking about like a bit. They'll be going up by like £4,000 or £5,000 on average. It's a lot of money. Okay, now these are middle-income households in general. Obviously, they're younger. They're going to be younger. There's going to be better off bits of younger cohorts that are going to get absolutely hammered. Did anyone buy a house in the last year here? Because you shouldn't have done that. Anyway, I'm afraid because those unlucky people are going to get the higher interest bills, but not get the lower house prices, which you can see in the data out this morning showing you pretty big house price falls already getting started. Like there is no way we can sustain current house prices with 3-4% interest rates. So like, well, if you're going to buy, just wait a little bit, everyone. I mean, you probably can't get a mortgage anyway now. But right, then last reason, this is just showing you the Office of Budget Responsibility's income forecast. So the same measure I started with, right? And showing you what does this mean. I just want to just spell out how bad what is going on is. So since the financial crisis, we didn't get a lot of income growth here. We did have a good phase. There was a good phase around 2015, which was falling gas prices plus fast rising employment, and when wages did get going a bit. Then this Brexit thing happened, you remember? And so broadly, you haven't had much income growth since. As I say, not big falls in the pandemic, really, because policy made a big difference. But huge falls, that's the 7% fall I was telling you about at the beginning. We don't get back to where you were in the pandemic until the second half of this decade. Yeah. So anyone in economics land saying, oh, things aren't too bad next year, which I promise you, I think that is the most, we're going to be in that world possibly by like March. And you used to look at these kind of charts and be like, that's what matters, not what, like the fact that it's a bit less difficult for you on your interest rate setting is not the exam question here. The exam question is what is happening to people trying to deal with higher food costs, higher. And remember, for people, it's the price level that matters. Right. Inflation does matter in terms of the macroeconomy. They should clearly care about it, but it's the price level. So the fact that oil and gas stops going up is less material than it's much higher than I'm used to. And remember, average energy price has been basically around £1,100 per household for like the last 15 years. Small fluctuations over time, but basically, and we're now talking 3,000. So the fact that inflation doesn't get any worse and go above 3,000 isn't much better for you because you still can't afford your even camping holiday because it's 2.5 times what you're used to. I won't go through this because I've said all that. That's what I concluded, but you already heard that, and we're already out of time. So, the end. Great.
Thank you very much, Torsten. So if I hadn't convinced you to check the Resolution Foundation's work, I hope now you're convinced. I hope like me, you feel that it was a great panel. Different approaches, but also making us very aware of the problem we're going to face. I feel that Yeva's and Isabella gave us some optimistic vibe, and then Torsten just, gloomy. And sorry, I should have said that Martijn couldn't join us. We had a confusion regarding the time, and he's in Australia, and he decided to sleep instead of join us. So, that doesn't make any sense. But I have a feeling that Martijn would kind of join Torsten gloomy approach in a sense that discussing how inflation in now liberal era has moved from price to assets, inflation, and so on, which would have been a great discussion. So if all of you agree that you can stay a little bit longer, do the technical issues, so we have probably 10 to 15 minutes discussion. So I'm not gonna say anything because I can see it's an amazing audience. We have all the IPP students here. I want to hear them ask questions, but also I see 2 members of the Positive Money think tank, which is another think tank. You should check their work out. So please just ask away. Who would like to be first? Everybody's shy. Here we go. Go, Austin.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
We can say it. Go on. We'll repeat it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation. Good luck, you can hear me. I have a question for Yeva in particular.
It's a question. It's a question for you, Yeva. Go on.
I 100% accept this framework by which there are microeconomic determinants of inflation.
He likes all your work. Keep going.
However, I wanted to ask whether there is a role and what is the role of traditional expansionary monetary policy in the inflation that we're seeing. Because of course there are supply bottlenecks, etc., but also when you look at the amount of money in circulation, there is a huge increase. Did that play a role, or?
Are you letting off?
I got it. I got it.
Go.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to be optimistic, by the way, if that's how it came across.
Sorry, that was
Yeah, my prediction has been that we're not going to see that soft landing, and I think that some people are hoping for. But so the quantity of money in the economy is not a very important variable, and I'm a very sort of Keynesian on this issue, right? So it's not the amount of money that matters, it's the amount of spending. And when monetary policy, if it has any impact on the economy, it's not in terms of the quantity of money or changing the quantity of money. It's really about changing interest rates, which then has the majority of its impact through asset prices, right? So central banks can't do very much when it comes to prices of output, labor, but they can be very effective in terms of asset prices, whether blowing a bubble or disinflating a bubble. I mean, you just have to look at the crypto markets and see what's going on there, right? A lot of it is getting wiped out because the Fed raised the interest rate. So in that sense, it's been very effective there. So to the extent that there is any room for monetary policy, I very much with Keynes on this one, that we have to keep interest rates low and just keep them there basically forever, not use them as a tool where we raise it, we lower it, raise it and lower it, because it has financial instability repercussions. So a very sort of Minskian in that sense, right? So I would say keep interest rates low to the extent that we're trying to address certain bottlenecks. Then low interest rates help they're not going to encourage more investment in certain areas, but at least they're not going to be prohibitive in that sense. So they, allowing for low interest rates and then trying to invest in certain areas like housing in case of the US, renewable energy, and things like that, the areas that are the bottlenecks. That's, I think, how monetary policy can help.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question.
Ms. Yeva, okay. This sounds very much like even the image of the war destroyed. Are you actually, because there was this moment when Saudi Arabia and China and there are these moments where you realize the policy of the military policy of the Russia is actually, we're only seeing 1/5 of the war making in Ukraine. The rest of it is happening via these kind of pressure points from, and is that purposefully in your mind that this is also not just sensitive, to manipulation in other ways, but that it's actually a war zone. These are war-making zones that you're trying to map their fragilities. And the second question is just what you said, what was raised now, is how will you surmount, if there is some price control or if there is some other methodology, how will you not inspire people to stop investing in that? And this whole conundrum of the oil and trying to disinvest and stop when in fact we need that oil to burn to make solar panels. It's more a question, like you said, who gets poorer. It's really how do we make the things we need to make, rather than how do we stop using this. So this whole, war and the future, how is it happening?
Easy.
Sorry.
Small questions.
Yeah.
Tired.
I think that actually go across the panel. Yeah.
I thought it was meant for Isabella because of the war
Yeah.
analogy. So if you want to take that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let me also start by saying that I'm not optimistic. I mean, I'm calling for economic policy disaster preparedness because I basically think we need something like a fire department for economic policy because more shocks are going to hit. And as Yeva has illustrated, the institutions that we have are not prepared to fight these fires. So these fires are in the pipeline. I mean, we are hoping they're not going to break out. We are hoping it will all be fine. And I mean, maybe that's going to be the world we are living in. I mean, everybody should be hoping and working towards that, but chances are that more shocks are hitting. So we should better get prepared. I mean, things like the Mississippi River being dried up and grain no longer being able to be shipped across the US is going to create another crisis in the grain market. So, I mean, the shocks are already coming, right? Will they be of the same magnitude? Probably, maybe not immediately in 2023, maybe again in 2024. I don't know, but it seems likely that more is to come. That kind of connects to the question of the geopolitical dimension here. So I happen to be of the opinion that, in particular, in relationship to China, I think we only have a chance as humanity, really, to manage the crisis that we are facing if we somehow manage to create a new framework for a stable global order, because I think if we are at war between the most important powers in the world and we are trying to fight climate change, we're pretty doomed. So that's just like as a precursor. But that being said, I was quite struck watching what happened in Europe, how clearly the European countries were engaged in a form of economic warfare with the sanctioned regimes, but did not prepare their own economies for the extremely predictable repercussions of this economic warfare that they were engaged in, which was really shocking and puzzling to me, to be honest. And I think that this has a lot to do with the economic mindset that people have, where there seems to be an idea that you can deal with a war economy type of situation by free market economic policies. And this to me is just a total illusion. I think that history proves this wrong. I think also that we see that whenever major wars happen, that there is this phase when everybody thinks like they can deal with these shocks in business as usual terms, and then they find out it's not working, and then eventually they start scrambling together new kinds of measures, like the measures that Torsten has been talking about in terms of fiscal responses and so on. Now, to the question of price controls and the energy sector. 2 points. The first one is, I agree and disagree with Torsten that, first, I agree that we have to distinguish between price controls that are basically price caps that function through fiscal subsidies and price caps that are actually regulatory price caps that say you may not charge a price that is higher than X. This latter kind of price control, in my mind, can work if it is being imposed relatively close to the source of a good. So that could work on the European level. It cannot work on the national level, which is why to have a sustainable price stabilization response to the current European crisis, we would need some form of European level price stabilization. That could involve a total wholesale cap, as some have been arguing. I personally think it would be good to have some price flexibility in the LNG part, but I mean, whatever the design of that would be, we would need something at the EU level. Now, if we do fiscally finance price caps, as the UK has been doing and as Germany has been doing, which I have been working on, it depends on the policy design. But if you design it in a way that it ends up being measured in your CPI, such that the CPI goes down, then yes, in the first place, is a statistical effect. But given that we are living in a world of central banks that tailor their response to inflation based on measured CPI and based on expected inflation, then kind of because of the ways in which we have designed our economic policy institutions, this does have a real effect because it takes some pressure off the ECB in that case, which I think is important in terms of possibly having some arguments against hawkish interest rate policies. But more importantly, if you design these fiscally financed price caps in a way where you combine them with a windfall profit tax, which is designed to make sure that the decreased cost, thanks to a fiscally financed price cap, is actually handed down along the value chain by businesses, then you can have an instrument that does lower inflation also substantially, not just as a statistical effect, but actually across the value chain in a substantive measure. Now, if we were to do actual price controls, not fiscally financed like subsidies that sustain price caps, but price controls that dictate prices to companies, which I think would be a possibility in oil and gas in the US. One has to talk about the level and so on, but I think in theory, it could be a possibility. What would this do to investment and output? This was the question that I'm getting at now. I think that counter to your initial intuition, you think, okay, if the price is being capped, this means that output will go down. This is actually not what is going to happen, because if you go through the earnings calls of fossil fuel companies and you look at what they're doing right now, then they're talking about having the best of times. And we actually have a forthcoming paper where we are tracing oil and gas profits globally. They are having the best of times, producing less at spectacularly high prices with lower costs. Why is that so? Because during the pandemic, they took a lot of their assets off the grid. So they stopped producing with the high cost assets and instead used the low cost assets to produce. Now their costs went down, their prices went up, their profits went through the roof. They have zero incentive to increase production. If you were to say your price is now going to be capped at X, which means that you can only increase your profits by producing more, then they would actually have more of an incentive to produce more. I'm not saying that we necessarily want more fossil fuel production. I'm just saying in terms of the ways in which the price cap operates, it can even be a situation in these extreme scenarios that we are talking about in times of emergencies, where a price cap can encourage more production. And this is something that we have also seen historically in the context of wars.
Thank you. So, yeah. Okay, so I have Simon and anyone else so I can get through. Okay, we have, oh yeah, okay, see you. Oh, okay, so go Simon.
Yeah, so I agree with what Yeva was saying, that it's not about the quantity of money, but actually demand and spending. But is there not an argument that what monetary policy can do is encourage people to spend less, right, by saving and delaying their consumption? So isn't that the argument? And I guess related to that, while I agree with Keynes and others that saving, investment creates savings and things like that, when people talk about increasing all of this investment in order to deal with the supply chain issues, as lots of countries which have found out when they've done industrialization drives, like in the Soviet Union, Japan, China and others, it becomes inflationary and they have to kind of encourage saving in other sectors of the economy. So therefore, as well as this investment in the things we need, do we also need to be restricting investment in other sectors which are less necessary, and do we also need to be encouraging savings?
Great. Can you see? Yeah, I can't see. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just more, obviously we talk about 1970s, stagflation, supply side shocks, the lack of optimism probably with deglobalisation, China and climate change, saying things aren't maybe necessarily better down the line, and that shift in thinking from Keynesianism to laissez-faire or the rise of monetarism. In terms of the long-term macro and policy outlook, what are the solutions do we think, like the Green New Deal or Marshall Plan for developing countries, that can actually solve these problems in the long term and make us slightly more optimistic, Torsten?
Thank you. I'm going to get a third one, then we can just do all together. Yeah? Yeah?
Hello, that's one question for everyone. So
can everybody hear? Yeva's,
can you hear?
yeah? Great.
Santander? Yeah, okay. So, Yeva, okay, I get your argument that inflation at the moment is supply driven. Do you consider that it's always the case, or do you acknowledge that inflation can be demand driven, at least in certain sectors such as housing or commodity markets at times? Isabella, in your paper, you mentioned ubiquity and volatility as two drivers of, how do you say, systemic significance of sectoral prices. So my question is, if we change the tools that we use to fight inflation and adopted tools along the lines that you put forward, and this had an influence on volatility, for instance, would that alter the results of your input-output regression? And Torsten, yeah, how do you get a shallow recession with a deep income fall? Like, can that even last, you know, for a prolonged time? Do you have an increase in debt? Or
Okay.
like
Yep.
And yeah, sorry, but just about the YouGov inflation expectation, like the 5 to 10 year range. I used to forecast inflation. I mean,
Don't worry about it.
You never do that, right?
Great. So we have lots going on. Should we start with you, Torsten?
Okay, well, there's lots there, so I'm conscious with it. So why don't I just pick up on two of them? So the investment question, I think, is leaving aside the specifics of Soviet era industrialization, but I think there is a general thing which is in the UK policy debate in particular, but actually you see versions of this in the US. There's obviously, and particularly you see this on I think you see it across the political spectrum, but it's probably slightly more prevalent on the left. There's a recognition we need a higher investment future, okay? Whether that's from public investment, whether it's through because of the net zero transition, or whether it's because we'd like our companies to actually grow at some point because we haven't had a wage rise for 15 years. So what there is almost no discussion of is what the implications of that, where the funds for that investment would come from, and the trade-offs that includes, which are at the most basic level, obviously, your broad choices. Would you like to have lower consumption for quite a considerable period of time for your households, or would you like to borrow from abroad to fund the investment? And you'll notice that the UK already does quite a lot of that, not least because of energy prices right now. Yeah. So there is basically zero discussion of that at all. And the reason that's a problem is because if you are in favour of that high investment, I am, then you should really care about whose consumption falls and how, and that will then have effects on the wider shape of your economy, right? Because the consumption falls for some people means other people's jobs, right? It's the same thing whenever everyone says to me, it's really important we get on with retrofitting loads of homes, and it's going to create loads of jobs. And so, that's true at the micro level. At the macro level, it's not going to create loads of jobs. It's going to move a load of activity from this part of the economy to this part of the economy. It's going to do it by reducing, depending on how you pay for it, by reducing some consumption of other things. So if households are paying for it themselves, they'll go out to eat less. Right? I mean, it will also save the planet, so we should do it. Okay, but the general thought, which is we always tell ourselves investment pays off quickly enough that there's no consumption fall, is basically broadly nonsense. And you do need to think through that kind of thing if you're interested in an actual economic project, as opposed to kind of just saying some things. So that's a good thing. On how can you get a shallow recession and a big fall in income? The answer is because the country's getting poorer, and it's not that we're producing less, it's that we can buy fewer goods. We're an open economy, so we can buy fewer goods around the world for what we produce in pounds, right? i.e. energy prices have gone up, we consume a lot of those, and they're almost all imported, and so we get poorer as households, even though our actual production level, as a separate thing, you still get some production falls, obviously, because it's more expensive to produce some things, which have those as inputs, and households are responding. But broadly, when the terms of trade shock is driving a lot of what's going on for households, it doesn't have to feed through into huge production falls domestically.
Great, thank you. Yeva?
Sure. So I think there is room for a savings policy if you are at a situation like full employment. So for example, Keynes talks about that in How to Pay for the War. I've used that same kind of approach in papers on the Green New Deal, which is another thing that came up. I think in general, we have to think of spending as a use of resources. And then, if there is too much spending, then we're using too much resources, right? And it can be public spending and private spending as well. So the question for me is not how do we limit the spending, so that sometimes that's necessary, but right now I think that's not really our problem, right? If we get to true full employment, then obviously, yes, how do we limit spending so that we can avoid inflation? Because inflation can be demand driven as well. I just don't think that the current inflation in particular is demand driven. So I would distinguish between true inflation, which is what we start to see when we get to full employment. And that's basically Keynes's definition of true inflation, right? And so I think we can rethink how we do fiscal policy. So this kind of indiscriminate fiscal policy, I call it the free market approach to fiscal policy, where we just give people money and let them just spend away, right? I think that's the wrong way to do it. So modern money theory economists have been advocating for targeted fiscal policy in the form of guaranteed jobs, for example. The Green New Deal obviously can be very important. I think over the long term, something like the Green New Deal is disinflationary. Investment demands resources in the time when you are doing that investment project, but over the long term, it pays for itself in the sense that it creates more capacity. So if we invest in renewables today, yes, we need more workers to, say, build solar panels, right? But over the long run, we have that capacity now that we can tap into in terms of energy. So it can lower energy costs over the long term. So, public investment in general, in particular areas, whether it's housing, whether it's energy, I think energy especially, because it also helps us tackle climate change, right? We tackle climate change. We also, create jobs, and hopefully good jobs, and expand our economy's capacity. If we have to do something like that, and if we're truly reaching our economy's capacity, then we can think of some ways to facilitate things like saving, right? But I don't think that this indiscriminate increase in interest rates is the right way to do it. We can try to think of other policies where we can encourage people to save. In general, I'm again with Keynes that saving is this two-part decision. First, you decide how much you save, and that depends on your income. So if you can't meet your necessities, obviously you're not going to save regardless of interest rates, right? Like those low-income households that Torsten was talking about, they're not going to be doing this saving regardless of the higher interest rates, right? The higher interest rates are going to be going to the asset holders, which happen to be the wealthier households. In a sense, when interest rates change, it's just a shuffling of assets from one asset class to another, right? It's that second step of the saving decision. How do you distribute the saving between different asset classes? That's where the interest rates come into the picture. So I think I've addressed all of the questions to some extent. And at this point, I actually have to run because I have a class to teach. So I'm just going to say thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye, Eva. We'll talk later. Thank you. Bye-bye. Isabella, please.
So I'm not sure if I heard the question correctly, but I gather it was like about the dimensions that feed into systemic significance in our model. Is that right?
It was how would your model show any different results if your policy regime was adopted? i.e. would different areas become significant?
Yeah, yes, it would show different results because, let's say you had a buffers. Let's say you didn't have only the strategic petroleum reserves in the way in which they are operating right now, but let's say they were backed up by the Fed doing open market operations for oil and would actually stabilize price spikes in oil, which is something that people like Saula Marova, for example, have been suggesting. And the Fed is pretty good at like buying when no one else is buying and selling when no one else wants to sell. So that's kind of the business that they have been doing for many decades. Let's say you had that kind of policy and you didn't have the extreme volatility in oil and gas prices anymore, then clearly in our model, that sector would decrease in its systemic significance for inflation, right? All that we are looking here is inflation as the relevant variable. If for housing you had like a big public investment push into housing, let's say, or you had preferential interest rates for first-time buyers, which brings down the cost of buying houses, it might like kind of bring down that measured cost of housing, then yes, that would affect the ways in which this enters into the CPI. So the weight of these expenditures would go down in the CPI, which would mean that in our model, the importance would go down. Maybe one afterthought on this whole question of investment. Not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, but I think there's a serious question of whether if these supply chain shocks are indeed going to turn out to be more intense, and if we see a further unraveling of global supply chains in the context of enormous geopolitical tensions, whether then we might not be hitting physical, real limits to investment in ways in which we haven't seen them in a pretty long time, which means that if you want to do large-scale investments in green stuff, let's say, you might be in a situation where certain critical components that you need for that are not readily available in a sufficient quantity, which raises a whole new question of industrial policy, where it's not just about like kind of putting the money where it needs to be, setting the right priorities with fiscal spending, but raises a whole new question of state capacity too. Like in the work that I've been doing on the government commission, I mean, one of the big questions that was kind of looming in the background was like, should we be making sure that systemically significant activities have enough and sufficiently cheap gas available if the gas crisis is going to become more severe? The answer is that currently states are not prepared to even understand what are the systemically significant parts of your economy, and do not even have the capacity to understand how at the end of the day a form of physical rationing could work. Now, I'm not advocating rationing, that's not the idea here, but the idea is that it's perceivable that depending on how this whole energy crisis plays out, and if we are serious about trying to do a transition to a green economy in a fast enough way to seriously do something about climate change, that we might be hitting some physical limits, which then raises the question of physical allocation in new kinds of ways.
Thank you, Isabella. Okay, so if you want to carry on this conversation, just join us upstairs for drinks. Obviously, Isabella can't join us, but after your first drink, you can write down a question and you can send her. But yeah, please join me to thank you, Isabella and Eva, for like join us for across the Atlantic. and Torsten for being here in person, but also the three of you for being doing this work on such an important matter for all of us. Yeah, thank you very much.